The cabin, a crude structure built by Daniel himself, creaked under the pressure of the storm. Grace sat by the fire, her hands trembling as she tried to stoke the dying embers, eyes flickering to the door every few seconds. She had never been this scared in her life. The memories of the raid that killed her husband were still fresh in her mind. The sound of gunshots, the screams, the chaos, it was all a blur, but the consequences were all too clear. Now she was alone, and her survival depended on something she didn't fully understand: the land itself. Outside, the snowstorm raged harder, and Grace stood to secure the shutters, her breath heavy and labored. She grabbed her rifle, a reflex born of caution and fear. The last thing she needed now was another surprise. Another raid, another fight she couldn't win. But as she stepped to the door, the sharp crack of a twig snapped her out of her thoughts. Her heart raced as she turned toward the sound, rifle raised. Was it a bear? A wild animal looking for food? Or, worse, someone else looking to claim her life? Silence. Then a soft grunt. Grace's grip tightened on the rifle. Her mind raced, but there was no time to decide what to do. The door trembled, the wood bending under the pressure of someone, or something, on the other side. The sounds of movement grew louder, heavier, more deliberate. Whoever, or whatever, was out there was coming closer. Then, with a force that sent the hinges creaking, the door burst open. Standing in the doorway was a man, a tall figure, draped in the fur-lined cloak of someone who had spent too long in the wilderness. His face was gaunt, his eyes deep-set, with a wildness to them that unsettled Grace. The man's clothes were torn, dirt caked into his skin, and there was an unmistakable scent of blood, though it wasn't his own. A wound on his side stained the fabric of his shirt, but he stood there, still, without making a move. She didn't lower the rifle. Her breath came in short bursts, and every instinct screamed at her to run, to shoot, to do anything that would get this man away from her. She was alone. A woman. He was a man, and worse, he wasn't a settler. His long black hair and the markings on his face told her enough. A Lakota man, one of the very people who had attacked her home. "Please," the man rasped, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Help." Grace's heart pounded. Her mind screamed at her to close the door, to protect herself. This man was no friend. He wasn't even human in her eyes, just another savage looking to take what was hers. But as his form swayed in the doorway, his hands raised in surrender, her better judgment kicked in. He looked like he was barely standing. She lowered the rifle just slightly, but kept it pointed at him. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice trembling but strong. "I'm dying," he said, his breath catching. "I need shelter, food, a place to rest. Just for a moment." Grace studied him. He wasn't armed. His hands were empty, and his eyes held no malice, only exhaustion. Still, the fear in her chest didn't waver. Her husband had died just days ago. She had no room for compassion now, no room for pity. But as she scanned the man's face, something inside her hesitated. Was it his vulnerability or the possibility that he could be a useful ally? It didn't matter. She was alone. "Why should I help you?" she asked, voice cold. "You're one of the ones who killed my husband." His eyes dropped. "I was not. I am not with them anymore." His words caught her off guard. The arrogance, the fierceness, all of the things she'd expected from a man like him, someone from the Lakota tribe, were gone. He seemed nothing like the warrior she'd imagined. He looked broken. His tribe, his people, had abandoned him. And Grace? Grace had nothing. No family left. No safety. No future. Her gaze softened just enough to see the humanity in his face. Despite the blood, despite the fear, despite the threat of betrayal, she realized something. He wasn't asking for much. Maybe, just maybe, he needed help more than she did. After a long pause, she made her decision. "Come in," she said sharply, lowering the rifle completely. "But no tricks. You so much as try anything, and I'll shoot you." He nodded weakly, his body shaking from the cold as he stepped through the door. Grace quickly shut it behind him, sealing them both off from whatever lay beyond. The man collapsed on the floor in front of the fire, his eyes fluttering as the warmth began to seep into his skin. Grace didn't speak. She didn't know what to say. He had no place in her world, and she had no place in his. Still, the silence stretched between them, filled with the crackling of the fire and the storm outside. The room was small, the only light coming from a hearth that flickered softly in the dimness. Grace watched him for a moment, her hand still on the rifle, but her guard slowly lowering. Her mind raced with uncertainty. Should she help him? Or was this just another trap, another moment of vulnerability that would cost her more than she could afford? The man shifted, his face contorted in pain. "I need food," he said weakly. "Please." Grace didn't answer. Instead, she moved to the small pantry, rifling through what little supplies she had left. She wasn't sure if she was being foolish, but something told her to help. Something inside her refused to see him as just another enemy. She returned to him, handing him a small loaf of bread and a piece of dried meat. He looked up at her, gratitude flickering in his eyes. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't respond, but the space between them had shifted. Whether it was out of necessity or something else, they were now bound together, for better or worse. The storm outside raged on, but for a moment, the warmth of the fire seemed to offer something more than just heat. It offered a fragile, uneasy truce, one neither of them could afford to break. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the scent of the hearth, and then she sat down across from him. Neither spoke, but the tension that had crackled in the air began to settle, just slightly. The days that followed were a blur of exhaustion, tension, and a kind of fragile cooperation. Grace woke early each morning to find the man, whom she had yet to ask his name, still alive but feverish. His wounds were grave, and she knew that if he wasn't tended to soon, he'd die on her floor. The thought unsettled her. She couldn't afford to get attached, but something in his eyes, the same hopelessness she saw in herself, compelled her to try. She made do with what little supplies she had left, boiling water, and attempting to treat his wound with crude herbs. The man never spoke much. He only watched her with quiet intensity, as though he were waiting for something, her approval, perhaps, or her rejection. Grace could hardly stand to look at him. He was a reminder of all that had gone wrong in her life, of all the violence she had witnessed, and yet there he was, broken and in need of help. The storm outside raged harder each day. They were trapped in the cabin, the world outside a blinding white wasteland of snow and wind. Grace spent her time rationing food, trying to keep the fire burning, but there was only so much she could do. The cabin was cold and cramped, and the isolation pressed in on her like the walls themselves were closing in. She had no choice but to share this space with the man, no choice but to live in this strange, uncomfortable silence. His name was Wakasa. He had told her one evening, just as she had finished preparing a small meal. He spoke the name with quiet reverence, almost as if it were a prayer. She didn't respond, didn't know what to say. There was nothing to say, nothing that could bridge the gap between them. The settlers had killed her husband. His people, his tribe, had done the same to her. Yet here they were, two souls tied together by circumstance, held together by survival. Wakasa's condition worsened. He barely ate, too weak to hold down food, too feverish to stay conscious for long. His body trembled violently in the night, shaking off the sweat that collected on his brow. Grace watched him, her mind torn between the disgust she felt for him and the pity she could not suppress. He wasn't a monster, not in the way she had imagined. He was just a man, another human caught in the web of violence, pain, and loss. She spent hours at his side, applying cold compresses to his forehead, forcing water into his cracked lips. He would mutter something in his native tongue, words she couldn't understand, but the tone was familiar. It was the tone of someone who had been abandoned, someone who had been left behind. It was a tone she knew too well. It wasn't until the third day, when he finally awoke with clearer eyes, that their unspoken truce began to take form. Grace was sitting at the table, watching the fire flicker. She hadn't slept much, the tension of the past few days still hanging heavy in her bones. Wakasa stirred, his eyes blinking open, unfocused at first, before they fixed on her. She didn't look at him, didn't want to acknowledge that, despite the pain, despite the blood and the death, they had both survived. He coughed, weakly at first, and then more harshly. I am sorry, he rasped. His voice was raw, a deep gravel that sounded foreign to her ears. For what my people have done. Grace didn't respond. She couldn't. The weight of the past was too heavy, and the anger that still seethed inside her had nowhere to go. She stared into the fire, her fingers gripping the edge of the table, until her knuckles ached. You are a settler, Wakasa continued, his voice faint but persistent. You hate me. I know this. Her jaw tightened. She looked at him then, her eyes cold, measuring. I don't hate you, she said slowly, each word like an effort. But I hate what you've done. What your people have done. You killed my husband. Wakasa's gaze dropped, and for the first time, Grace saw something akin to shame in his eyes. It was fleeting, but it was there. He opened his mouth to speak, but Grace silenced him with a raised hand. I know what it is to be lost, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. To have everything taken from you. You are not the only one who suffers. He said nothing, but she could feel his gaze on her. There was no anger in his eyes anymore, just a kind of understanding that unnerved her. She wasn't sure how long they sat like that, the air between them thick with unspoken words. It was late afternoon when they heard it, the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow outside the cabin. Grace froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She grabbed her rifle, without thinking, a reflex born of months of survival instinct. Wakasa shifted slightly, his eyes alert, though he remained still. He didn't make a sound, didn't offer any indication that he would help, and yet she knew. He would fight if it came to that. The footsteps grew louder, and then the door creaked under pressure. Grace's finger hovered over the trigger. She could feel Wakasa's presence behind her, his body tense with anticipation, but he made no move to warn her. He, too, was waiting, watching, assessing. The door swung open abruptly. A figure stood in the doorway, a man dressed in thick furs, with a rough, weather-beaten face that was unmistakable. Another settler. His rifle was raised, and his eyes darted between Grace and Wakasa, narrowing as he took in the scene. Grace didn't lower her weapon. The tension was immediate, suffocating, as both sides evaluated the other. Ma'am, the man spoke first, his voice gruff. We've been tracking a Lakota. You seen one around here? Grace didn't hesitate. She lifted her chin, staring him down. No, she lied, though the words felt heavy on her tongue. Haven't seen anyone. The settler eyed her for a long moment, suspicion crawling across his face. Then, without a word, he turned and stepped back into the storm, leaving Grace and Wakasa in a silence that was almost more deafening than the storm outside. They were still there, alone in the cabin, bound by nothing but the bitter cold and the rawness of survival. But something had shifted in that moment. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were two people, fragile and broken, caught in a world that had no place for them. And somehow, together, they had to find a way forward. The days grew longer, the storm relentless, but within the cramped cabin, a fragile truce had taken root. Grace moved through her routines with a mechanical precision, tending the fire, rationing food, and patching up the cracks in the cabin. Wakasa, though still weak, had started to recover. His fever had broken, and the wound in his side, while still painful, seemed to be healing. He didn't speak much, but there was a quiet strength to him now, an understanding between them that hadn't existed before. Grace couldn't quite place it, but she no longer felt the same urge to recoil from his presence. He wasn't just the enemy, the symbol of the violence that had torn apart her world. He was a man, a person, someone who had known loss, someone who had been cast aside. And, despite everything, she had begun to see something in him that reminded her of her own struggle, the fight to survive, the drive to live despite everything that told her to give up. It wasn't just the silence that grew between them. It was the small things. The way Wakasa would help her chop firewood, silently but efficiently. The way he shared the warmth of his body when the cold became unbearable at night, moving closer to the fire as if instinctively knowing she would need it. They didn't speak of it. They didn't have to. One afternoon, as Grace prepared a meager meal, Wakasa offered a piece of venison he'd caught in the woods, a gesture so rare and selfless that it caught her off guard. It was a small offering, but it was enough to shift something within her. She accepted it without a word, but the bond between them deepened, a quiet understanding that they were no longer just two people coexisting out of necessity. There was something more now, an unspoken alliance born of shared hardship. Days passed, and they began to communicate differently. Words were fewer, but their actions spoke volumes. Wakasa would watch Grace carefully as she worked, his gaze steady and unwavering. She caught him sometimes, as though he were studying her, learning the rhythm of her movements. She, in turn, did the same. His presence, once a source of fear and suspicion, now seemed to calm her. The familiarity of it, the quiet companionship, felt almost normal, though it was a far cry from a life she had once imagined. Grace didn't know when it started, but she found herself waiting for him to wake each morning. He had begun to rise earlier than her, his dark silhouette framed by the light of the fire. She would catch a glimpse of him, his face softer in the light, his brow less furrowed than the night before. She didn't know why it mattered, but it did. Wakasa was becoming more than just a wounded man in need of shelter. He was becoming something she didn't know how to name. And perhaps, just perhaps, she was becoming something more to him as well. One morning, when the sun had barely begun to rise, Grace stepped outside to gather firewood. The snow was fresh, thick, and untouched by footprints. She stood still for a moment, breathing in the crisp air, feeling the stillness of the world around her. She hadn't realized how much she had missed the simple act of standing outside, of feeling the cold seep into her bones. It made her feel alive, but her brief respite was interrupted by a sudden movement in the distance. Wakasa's figure emerged from the tree line, his silhouette a sharp contrast against the white of the snow. He had been out since before dawn, hunting or tracking. She wasn't sure which. He had a deer slung over his shoulder, its limp form draped across his back like a prize. He moved with a quiet grace, the kind of purposeful stride that came with years of survival in the wild. Grace turned away quickly, not wanting him to catch her watching. It was a strange feeling, one she couldn't quite understand. The need to protect something she didn't want to admit had become important. By the time Wakasa returned to the cabin, the sun had risen fully, casting a golden light through the cracks in the walls. He didn't speak as he entered, but his presence filled the space with a quiet weight. Grace didn't ask about his hunt. She didn't need to. It was a routine now, something they both understood. But when he dropped the deer at the entrance and looked at her, something in his gaze shifted. "You are strong," he said, his voice low but clear. It was the first time he had spoken to her with anything more than necessity in his tone. Grace blinked, not sure how to respond. She had expected him to comment on the firewood she had gathered or the meal she was preparing, but instead, his words caught her off guard. Strong? She didn't feel strong. She felt weak, brittle. Her hands trembled as she set the knife down on the table. She finally met his gaze, the weight of his words lingering between them. "I'm just trying to survive," she said, her voice tight. Wakasa nodded, a slight movement, but his expression remained thoughtful. "It is the same for all of us," he replied quietly, though his eyes betrayed something deeper, something that Grace couldn't quite decipher. For the first time, she saw him not as a Lakota man or a stranger, but as someone who had been living the same fight she had. They were both surviving, day by day, bound by nothing but the raw will to keep going. As the days wore on, their routines became more synchronized. Grace worked in the mornings, while Wakasa hunted in the afternoons. They rarely spoke, but there was a quiet understanding between them, a trust that had slowly formed through their shared experiences. They learned each other's rhythms, the way Grace would pause before taking a breath, the way Wakasa would scan the trees for danger before he stepped forward. There were no more tense moments, no more fear that the other might betray them. It was late one evening when the first real conversation came. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the room. Grace sat on the floor, peeling the skin off a potato, while Wakasa worked on mending his coat by the fire. "I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again," she said, breaking the silence. Her voice was softer than usual, hesitant. Wakasa didn't look up, but his hand stilled. "No one feels safe in a world like this," he said quietly. "Not now. Not after everything that's happened." Grace exhaled slowly. She had always believed that there would be an end to the violence, an end to the suffering. But now here, in this cabin, with a man she had once thought of as nothing more than an enemy, she understood that the world had changed, perhaps forever. "You're right," she said after a long pause, her voice steady but tinged with something darker. "But maybe that's why we keep going. Because we have to. For whatever comes next." Wakasa looked at her then, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment, everything else fell away. There was no cabin, no storm, no war. Just two people, surviving together in a world that didn't care whether they lived or died. And in that moment, they understood each other in a way that words could never explain. The storm outside had worsened, the wind now howling like a beast on the hunt. The cabin, once a place of uneasy refuge, had become cage, its walls pressing in on Grace and Wakasa. Their time together, fragile and tense, was about to be shattered. The world outside had already made its intentions clear. They were both targets, and the longer they stayed in one place, the more likely they were to die. The sound of approaching boots was unmistakable. It was a slow, deliberate rhythm, too purposeful to be the wind. Grace's hand tightened around the rifle she had come to rely on. Wakasa, sitting across from her, didn't need to ask. He stood silently, moving toward the window to peer out into the blinding snow. His expression, usually guarded, had softened in recent days, but now his eyes were sharp, filled with the same focused intensity she had first seen when they met. "They're coming," he murmured. Grace nodded, trying to ignore the weight in her chest. She had known this moment would come. The settlers from the nearby town had never given up the hunt, and now their persistence had brought them to her door. "How many?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. Wakasa squinted through the window, his sharp gaze scanning the horizon. "At least 3. Maybe more." She swallowed hard, her mind racing. 3 men were nothing compared to the full force of the settlers, but the numbers didn't matter. The question was whether they could survive long enough to fight them off. "We can't outrun them," Grace said quietly, more to herself than to Wakasa. "We can't hide anymore." Wakasa's eyes flickered to her. "Then we fight," he said simply, as though it was the only answer that mattered. She wasn't sure if the cold in the cabin came from the storm outside or from the reality of his words. But there was something in his voice, something resolute, that made her realize he wasn't just saying this to calm her nerves. He meant it. She had never thought she would have to fight. Not like this. The world outside had seemed so far away, but now it was closing in. This was it. This was survival. Wakasa moved quickly, securing the door and checking the windows. Grace followed him, her heart pounding as the minutes ticked by. They worked in silence, an unspoken understanding passing between them. There was no room for fear now. There was only action. The sound of the settlers grew louder, closer. The moment was at hand. Grace and Wakasa took their positions near the back of the cabin, hidden from view, but ready. The rifle was in Grace's hands, her fingers wrapped around it with an unshakable grip. Beside her, Wakasa stood like a shadow, his bow and knife ready. He wasn't a man of words now, and neither was she. The door crashed open. The first man entered, a tall figure with rough stubble and a grin set to his jaw. He froze as his eyes scanned the room, momentarily confused by the silence. Grace didn't hesitate. She aimed her rifle at him, her heart thundering in her chest. "Get out," she commanded, her voice low and fierce. The man's eyes narrowed, and he drew his own rifle, pointing it directly at her. "You're not going anywhere, woman. The town wants you dead." Without warning, the shot rang out. It wasn't from Grace, but from Wakasa. The arrow flew across the room, hitting the man in the shoulder with a sickening thud. He fell back, cursing loudly, his rifle clattering to the floor. Grace's heart raced as she aimed the rifle at the second man, who had just entered the doorway. This time, there was no hesitation. She fired, the bullet striking him in the chest. He collapsed without a sound, his body crumpling in a heap at the threshold. The last man, his face twisted with rage, dove toward the fallen rifle of his comrade. But Wakasa was faster. He moved with the speed of a predator, his knife flashing as he closed the distance. The man never saw it coming. In an instant, Wakasa drove the blade into his side, and the man crumpled to the ground, his life draining out of him. The cabin was silent again. The air was thick with the smell of blood, the acrid scent of gunpowder, and the bitter cold. Grace stood, rifle still in hand, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her hands shook, the adrenaline of the fight still coursing through her veins. Wakasa stood a few feet away, his eyes scanning the room, the door, his every movement controlled and calm, even after the chaos. "It's not over," he said quietly, his voice grave. "There will be more. They won't stop." Grace nodded. She knew this. She could feel it deep in her bones. But for now they had won. For now they were alive. She looked at the bodies on the floor. 3 men who had come to take her life, to take Wakasa's. 3 men who had been so certain of their mission, but who had never expected to face resistance. The irony wasn't lost on her. They had come to kill, but it was they who had died. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but filled with emotion. Wakasa didn't look at her. He didn't need to. His gratitude was silent, expressed in the sharpness of his movements, the way he began to drag the bodies outside without a word. Grace followed him, feeling the weight of what had just happened. She had fought, she had killed, and now she had to live with that. It wasn't a feeling she was used to. It wasn't something she had ever imagined she would face. But in this world, in this unforgiving place, it was survival. It was the only option. As they stood in the doorway, looking out at the wilderness that stretched before them, Wakasa spoke again, his voice steady as always. "We keep moving," he said. Grace didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked out into the snow, her breath visible in the cold air. The storm hadn't let up, but the world outside didn't feel as threatening as it had before. It felt like something she could endure. "We keep moving," she repeated softly, her voice gaining strength. They had survived this, and, together, they would survive whatever came next.